When did the group mom finally stop protecting everyone? Sophie had been covering for our friend group since sophomore year, taking the fall for everything, keeping us out of trouble no matter what stupid thing we did. Every weekend for 3 years, she was basically our get-out-of-jail-free card. She'd memorized campus security patterns, knew which RAs would look the other way, had emergency alibis ready for everyone. She'd personally saved me from expulsion twice. When campus security found weed in our suite, Sophie claimed it was all hers, took a possession charge that went on her permanent record. When I cheated on my ethics final, ironic, I know, she took the blame, said she'd given me her notes without realizing I'd use them. Got academic probation while I kept my 3.8 GPA. She'd taken assault charges for Brad when he punched that guy at the bar, claimed self-defense as a woman, got community service while Brad kept his clean record for med school. Testified that Ara's DUI was actually her driving. Claimed she was the one sexting the professor's wife to save Jansen from Title IX. Hid cocaine for the whole group during a raid, got arrested, spent a night in jail, never snitched. The night everything changed was homecoming. October 23rd, huge alumni party at the president's house. Sophie was there as always, sober and watching everyone, ready to take whatever blame came our way. She'd already talked security out of searching Brad's bag, full of Molly, convinced an alum that Ara's racist rant was performance art, and physically stopped Jansen from live-streaming himself doing lines in the president's bathroom. I wasn't there when it happened. I'd left early. But the security footage told the whole story. While Sophie was cleaning up Ara's vomit in the bathroom, our group decided to play a prank. They took Sophie's phone and sent a bomb threat to the university from her number. Thought it would be hilarious to cancel Monday's midterms. Jansen was recording, laughing about how Sophie would handle it like she always does. Ara typed the message. Brad hit send. They put her phone back in her purse and went back to partying. The FBI showed up in 40 minutes. Sophie was in the bathroom when they evacuated the building. They found her phone, tracked the threat, arrested her on the spot. Terrorism charges, federal crime. She kept saying she didn't do it, but our friends had been careful. Worn gloves, used her typical typing style, even included grammar mistakes she commonly made. Sophie called them 20 times from holding. They sent her to voicemail every time except once. Brad answered, music blasting. Don't worry, you always figure it out. Then hung up. Sophie spent 3 days in federal detention while they investigated. Her parents had to put their house up for bail. $500,000. She was facing 25 years in prison. At trial, our friends testified against her. Said she'd been acting unstable. That she'd always been obsessed with attention. Ara actually said Sophie had a history of criminal behavior, listing all the times Sophie had taken the fall for Ara's crimes. Sophie got 7 years, federal prison, no parole. She was supposed to graduate magna cum laude, had a job lined up at a nonprofit. Now she's in a cell because she spent 3 years protecting people who threw her away like garbage. But here's what those idiots didn't know. Sophie had been recording everything for years. Every crime she covered up, every fall she took, every time they asked her to lie. Hours of video and audio, all backed up to a cloud they didn't know existed. Her lawyer sent me the files, asked if I'd testify. I said yes, but I'm not just testifying. My father runs the state attorney's office. He's about to receive evidence of 43 crimes committed by Brad, Ara, and Jansen. Crimes with no statute of limitations. Crimes Sophie can prove she didn't commit, despite taking the blame. They're about to learn what happens when you sacrifice the only person keeping you out of prison. I opened Sophie's lawyer's email at 11 p.m. and started clicking through the files. The first video showed me at a party sophomore year, red cup in hand, laughing while Sophie scrubbed vomit off a bathroom floor. My voice came through clear as day, telling Brad that Sophie would handle the mess like she always did. The second file was audio from the night campus security found weed in our suite. I heard myself coaching Sophie on what to say, making sure she knew to claim it was all hers. The third was a text thread, where I thanked her for taking my academic fraud charge, complete with a joke about how she saved my GPA. Every single crime I thought was buried existed in crystal clear video or audio with dates, times, and my face visible in most of them. The folder labeled Drug Possession, October 2019, contained 3 videos of me handing Sophie my stash before a raid, asking her to hide it, promising I'd pay her back somehow. She never asked me to pay her back. The academic fraud, December 2019 folder had recordings of me begging her to take the blame for giving me test answers, crying about losing my scholarship. She took academic probation without hesitating. I clicked through 43 folders total, each one containing proof of a crime Sophie covered up for someone in our group. By 3 a.m., I was throwing up in my bathroom, seeing my own face over and over, hearing my own voice thanking Sophie for destroying her future to protect mine. The folder labeled Assault, March 2020, showed Brad punching a guy outside a bar while I stood there filming it on my phone, laughing. Sophie's voice came through clearly, telling the cops she threw the punch in self-defense. Brad kept his clean record for medical school applications. I kept watching. I found the cocaine possession arrest from last year, video of all of us shoving our drugs into Sophie's bag when we heard sirens. She spent a night in jail and never told the cops whose cocaine it actually was. The Title IX folder showed Jansen sexting a professor's wife while drunk, with audio of Sophie calling Jansen's phone repeatedly trying to stop him. When the university investigated, Sophie claimed she sent the messages as a prank. Jansen stayed enrolled. Every file had timestamps and locations. Every crime was documented with the kind of detail that would hold up in court. Sophie had been recording everything for 3 years, backing it all up to a cloud storage account none of us knew existed. She never planned to use it against us. Her lawyer's note said Sophie only gave her access after the FBI arrested her, hoping the recordings would prove she wasn't the type of person who'd send a bomb threat. Instead, our friends used the same recordings against her at trial, listing her criminal history as evidence she was unstable. I grabbed my phone at 6 a.m. before I could change my mind and called my father. He answered on the third ring, groggy and confused about why I was calling so early. I started talking before he could ask questions, words spilling out about Sophie and the bomb threat and 3 years of crimes we made her cover up. I told him about the recordings, about Brad and Ara and Jansen framing her, about all of us testifying against her while she sat in federal court facing 25 years. My father stayed quiet the entire time, not interrupting once, just letting me talk. When I finally stopped, out of breath and shaking, he was silent for at least 30 seconds. Then he told me to come to his office at 9 with everything I had. His voice sounded different, harder than usual, like he'd already switched into prosecutor mode. He hung up without saying goodbye. I showed up at the state attorney's office at 8:45 with 3 USB drives containing copies of all Sophie's files. My hands shook so badly, I dropped the drives twice trying to set them on my father's desk. He picked them up without commenting on my shaking and plugged the first one into his computer. We sat in silence while he opened files, his face completely blank in that way prosecutors have when they're reviewing evidence. He watched the first video of me laughing at a party while Sophie cleaned up my mess. He listened to audio of me coaching her to lie to campus security. He read through text messages where I thanked her for taking my drug charge. After the third file, he stopped the playback and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't just disappointment, though that was definitely there. It was something else too, something that looked almost like respect mixed with the disappointment. He asked if I understood what I was giving him. I nodded. He asked if I understood that these recordings showed me committing crimes too. I nodded again. He studied my face for a long moment, then asked why I was doing this now. I told him the truth, that watching Sophie get convicted while we all lied was the moment I realized I'd become someone I couldn't recognize in the mirror anymore. He nodded slowly and went back to reviewing files. My father spent 2 hours going through the drives methodically, taking notes in his legal pad. Finally, he looked up and explained that Sophie's recordings were admissible as evidence because she was a party to the crimes she documented. The 43 incidents I'd mentioned in my phone call included several felonies with no statute of limitations, meaning Brad, Ara, and Jansen could still be prosecuted years later. He asked if I understood that cooperating with prosecutors meant I'd face consequences for my own crimes too. I told him I knew, that I deserved whatever happened to me. He asked if I was prepared to testify against my former friends in court. I said yes without hesitating. He made more notes, then asked if I was doing this because I felt guilty or because I actually wanted to help Sophie. I thought about lying, but he'd see through it, so I admitted it was both. Guilt was eating me alive, but also Sophie was serving 7 years in federal prison for something she didn't do while the actual criminals walked free. He seemed satisfied with that answer. He explained the process for what would happen next, how he'd assign a prosecutor to review everything and build cases. He warned me this would take months, maybe longer, and that I'd need to be prepared for my former friends to retaliate. I told him I understood. He asked one more time if I was sure about this, if I was ready for my life to change permanently. I looked at the computer screen showing Sophie's mugshot from her arrest and said I was sure. My father picked up his office phone and called someone named Nolan Richardson. He explained the situation briefly, mentioning federal terrorism charges and newly discovered evidence, then told Nolan to come to his office immediately. Nolan showed up 15 minutes later, a tall guy in his 40s with gray at his temples and sharp eyes that took in everything about me in one sweep. My father introduced him as his best federal prosecutor, former FBI agent who specialized in complex conspiracy cases. Nolan shook my hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, professional in a way that made me feel like I was already a witness being evaluated. His eyes never left my face during the handshake, and I could tell he was already calculating how I'd perform on a witness stand, whether I'd crack under cross-examination, if I could be trusted. My father handed him one of the USB drives and gave him a quick summary of what the files contained. Nolan plugged it into his laptop right there and started reviewing files while I sat in the chair across from my father's desk. He didn't ask me any questions yet, just watched videos and listened to audio recordings with his prosecutor face on, completely neutral. After about 20 minutes, he looked up and asked my father if he'd verified the recordings were authentic. My father said he'd have tech forensics confirm it, but the metadata looked legitimate and the content was too detailed to be fabricated. Nolan nodded and kept watching files. When he finally spoke to me, he asked how long I'd known Sophie was innocent of the bomb threat. I told him I'd known from the beginning because I wasn't at the party when it happened, but I'd heard Brad, Ara, and Jansen bragging about it afterward. Nolan made a note and asked why I didn't come forward during Sophie's trial. I didn't have a good answer except that I was a coward who didn't want to face consequences. He studied me for a moment, then said, at least I was being honest now, which was more than most witnesses gave him. Nolan took all 3 USB drives and told me to clear my schedule for the next week. We'd be going through every file together so he could build a complete timeline and understand the full scope of what Sophie had documented. He explained that his job was to build criminal cases against Brad, Ara, and Jansen for the bomb threat and any other crimes with prosecutable evidence. My job was to provide context and testify about what I personally witnessed. He warned me this would be exhausting and uncomfortable because I'd have to relive 3 years of watching Sophie sacrifice herself for us. I told him I was ready. My father scheduled daily meetings starting the next morning at his office, 4 hours each day until we finished reviewing everything. Nolan shook my hand again before leaving, and this time his grip felt different, less evaluative, and more like he was accepting me as part of his team. After he left, my father told me to go home and get some rest because the next few days would be brutal. I asked if he was disappointed in me. He said he'd been disappointed in me for 3 years, but hadn't known why until now, and at least I was finally doing something about it. That hurt more than if he'd just said yes. Over the next 3 days, Nolan and I went through every single file Sophie had saved. We met in a conference room at the state attorney's office, just the 2 of us and a laptop, working through folders systematically. Nolan created a massive timeline on a whiteboard, listing dates and crimes and who was involved in each incident. He asked detailed questions about every recording, wanting to know locations, who else was present, what happened before and after the documented moment. The cocaine possession charge from last year particularly interested him because drug trafficking carried serious federal penalties. He made me walk him through that entire night, how we'd been partying at Jansen's apartment when someone saw cops in the parking lot. We'd all panicked and shoved our drugs into Sophie's purse because she was the only one sober enough to think clearly. Sophie had grabbed the purse and walked outside to meet the cops, claiming everything was hers. She got arrested while the rest of us stayed inside, safe. Nolan asked if I understood that Sophie had probably saved me from federal prison that night. I said yes. He asked if I'd thanked her. I said yes, and he pulled up a text message I'd sent her the next day with a joke about owing her forever. He asked if I'd actually planned to pay her back somehow. I admitted I hadn't, that I'd just assumed she'd keep covering for us because that's what she always did. Nolan made a note and moved to the next folder. The assault case where Sophie claimed self-defense for Brad's bar fight got similar attention. Nolan pulled up the video I'd filmed on my phone, showing Brad clearly throwing the first punch at a guy who'd bumped into Ara. Sophie's voice came through on the recording, already planning what she'd tell the cops. Brad never even got questioned because Sophie took the charges before police could investigate further. She got community service while Brad's record stayed clean for medical school applications. Nolan asked if I knew Brad had applied to med schools using his clean record. I said yes, that Brad had bragged about getting into a top program. Nolan made another note. We spent an entire day just on the academic fraud cases, because there were multiple incidents of Sophie taking blame for cheating. My case got the most attention because I'd cheated on an ethics final, which Nolan said was ironic enough to mention in court. The recording showed me begging Sophie to say she'd given me her notes without realizing I'd used them to cheat. She took academic probation while I kept my 3.8 GPA and my scholarship. Nolan asked if I understood that Sophie's probation had probably cost her graduate school opportunities. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yes, obviously it had. He asked if that had mattered to me at the time. I said no, that I'd only cared about keeping my scholarship. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. On the third day, Nolan told me he'd contacted the FBI agent who originally arrested Sophie. Agent Tiago Soto had handled the terrorism case and had been the one to put handcuffs on Sophie at the homecoming party. Nolan said Soto remembered the case clearly because Sophie had insisted she didn't send the bomb threat even after her friends testified against her. Most suspects changed their story when evidence piled up, but Sophie never wavered in claiming innocence. Soto admitted to Nolan that he'd had doubts about the conviction, especially after watching Sophie's friends testify. Their stories had been too coordinated, too perfect, like they'd rehearsed together. But the physical evidence was solid. The threat came from Sophie's phone, and her friends all confirmed she'd been acting unstable. Soto had pushed his doubts aside and moved on to other cases. Now, Nolan was asking him to review the new evidence and potentially testify that the original investigation had missed signs of Sophie's innocence. Soto had agreed to meet with us next week. Nolan explained that having the original arresting agent admit doubts about the conviction would be powerful for Sophie's appeal. It would show that even law enforcement had concerns about how the case was handled. I asked if Soto was mad about being wrong. Nolan said Soto was a good agent who cared more about truth than being right, and he'd be relieved to help fix a wrongful conviction. That made me feel slightly better about the meeting. My father called me into his office on Friday and told me he'd set up a meeting with Sophie's lawyer for the following Monday. He warned me she was going to be hostile because I was part of the group that destroyed Sophie's life. She'd probably question my motives and my credibility, and I needed to be prepared to take whatever anger she directed at me. I asked if he'd be there. He said no, that this meeting needed to be between me, Sophie's lawyer, and Nolan. I'd have to face her questions alone. I spent the entire weekend rehearsing what I'd say, practicing in front of my bathroom mirror like I was preparing for a presentation. Every version sounded wrong. I tried apologizing first, but that felt like I was centering my guilt instead of Sophie's suffering. I tried explaining the evidence first, but that felt too clinical. I tried being matter-of-fact about my crimes, but that sounded like I was minimizing what we'd done. By Sunday night, I'd given up on rehearsing and decided to just tell the truth however it came out. Nothing I said would be adequate anyway. Nothing would give Sophie back the 7 months she'd already served or undo the trauma of being arrested by the FBI and convicted of terrorism. Sophie's lawyer's office was in a converted house downtown, the kind of place that still had residential features like a fireplace and crown molding. The receptionist led me to a conference room where a woman in her 50s sat reviewing documents. She looked up when I entered, and her expression made me want to leave immediately. She looked at me like I was something disgusting she'd found on her shoe, something she'd scrape off and forget about. I sat down across from her, and she introduced herself without offering to shake hands. She said Nolan had explained why I was there and what evidence I was bringing. She wanted to hear it directly from me before she looked at any files. I started explaining about Sophie's recordings and how they documented 3 years of crimes she'd covered up for our friend group. She listened without interrupting, her face completely neutral, taking occasional notes. When I finished, she set down her pen and asked why I waited until Sophie was in prison to grow a conscience. Her voice wasn't angry, just cold and factual, like she was cross-examining a hostile witness. I didn't have a good answer. I tried to explain about hitting rock bottom and finally realizing what we'd done, but it sounded like excuses even to me. She cut me off and asked the question again, more specifically this time. Why did I stay silent during Sophie's trial when I knew she was innocent? Why did I let her get convicted? Why did I wait 7 months to come forward? I stopped trying to make excuses and told her the truth. I was a coward who let Sophie sacrifice herself over and over because it was easier than facing consequences. I'd watched her take the fall for my crimes, and I'd thanked her for it. I'd known she was innocent of the bomb threat, and I'd stayed silent because coming forward meant admitting my own guilt. I'd chosen my future over hers every single time. Sophie's lawyer studied me for a long moment, her expression still unreadable. Then she said that at least I was finally being honest, and honesty was more than she'd expected from anyone in my former friend group. She asked to see the files. I pulled out the first USB drive and plugged it into her laptop. The screen filled with folder after folder, each one labeled with dates and names. She clicked on the first one marked Brad Assault March 15th, and a video started playing. Sophie's voice came through clearly, talking to Brad outside the bar where he'd punched that guy. Brad was laughing about how the dude deserved it, how he'd do it again, and Sophie was gently asking if he wanted her to say it was self-defense. Brad said yes, without even thinking about it. The lawyer's pen started moving across her notepad so fast I could hear it scratching. She opened another file, this one audio of Ara asking Sophie to take the DUI charge. Ara was slurring her words, clearly drunk, saying she'd lose her scholarship if she got caught. Sophie agreed immediately, like she always did. The lawyer opened 5 more files in rapid succession, watching clips of me, Jansen, Brad, and Ara, asking Sophie to cover for us over and over. Each time Sophie said yes. Each time we thanked her and moved on with our lives while she dealt with the consequences. The lawyer stopped the playback and turned to me. She asked how many files were in the collection total. I told her Sophie had documented 43 separate incidents over 3 years. The lawyer sat back in her chair and was quiet for maybe 30 seconds. Then she started asking questions rapid fire. What were the exact dates of Sophie's arrest and trial? Did Sophie ever waver in claiming her innocence? Did the prosecution interview any of us separately or just accept our group testimony? I answered everything I could remember. She took notes on every response, occasionally stopping to pull up a file and verify something against what I was saying. She explained that this evidence changed everything about Sophie's case. The recordings proved Sophie had a pattern of taking blame for others, which directly contradicted the prosecution's theory that she sent the bomb threat for attention. More importantly, the DA never investigated Sophie's claims that someone else used her phone, never looked into whether the friend group might be lying. That could be prosecutorial misconduct. She said newly discovered evidence was one of the few grounds for overturning a federal conviction, but the evidence had to be significant enough that it would have changed the trial outcome. These recordings were exactly that kind of evidence. They showed Sophie was innocent and that the real criminals testified against her to save themselves. I asked what happened next. She said she'd need to coordinate with the federal prosecutors who were building cases against Brad, Ara, and Jansen. She'd file a motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence, and my testimony would be crucial for both Sophie's appeal and the criminal cases against the others. I'd need to be formally deposed within 2 weeks, which meant sitting in a room with lawyers from both sides answering questions under oath for hours. She warned me it would be brutal. The defense attorneys for Brad, Ara, and Jansen would try to destroy my credibility, paint me as unreliable, suggest I had ulterior motives for coming forward. I told her I understood, and I'd do whatever was needed. She studied me again with that same unreadable expression, then said she'd call Nolan and my father to set up a coordination meeting. She stood up, which I took as my signal to leave. I gathered the USB drives and headed for the door. She stopped me before I left and said one more thing. She said Sophie spent 7 months in federal prison maintaining her innocence, while everyone called her a liar and a terrorist. Whatever I did from here on out, nothing would give Sophie back those 7 months, or erase the trauma of being arrested by the FBI and convicted of a crime she didn't commit. I needed to understand that going in. I told her I knew, that I'd live with the guilt of what I let happen to Sophie for the rest of my life. She nodded and opened the door. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone for an hour before I finally pulled up the prison's inmate calling system. Sophie's lawyer had given me the information for how to set up an account and receive calls. I entered all my details, loaded $20 onto the account, and sent a request for Sophie to call me. The system said inmates could see call requests during their evening recreation time. I waited by my phone for 3 hours. At 9 p.m., it rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and an automated voice said I had a call from an inmate at the Federal Correctional Facility. I pressed 1 to accept. There was silence on the other end. I said Sophie's name. More silence. Then the automated voice came back saying the inmate had disconnected the call. She'd refused it. I sat there holding my dead phone, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Her lawyer had warned me this would probably happen. Sophie had every right to refuse my call, to never speak to me again. I'd been part of the group that destroyed her life. Why would she want to hear from me now? I opened my laptop and started writing instead. I wrote everything I should have said 7 months ago when Sophie got arrested. I apologized for every time I let her take the fall for my crimes, for staying silent during her trial, for being too much of a coward to tell the truth when it mattered. I explained about the recordings, about going to my father, about Nolan, and the cases being built against Brad, Ara, and Jansen. I told her I was testifying at her appeal and in the criminal cases, that I'd already confessed my own crimes to my father and would face whatever consequences came. I wrote that I knew none of it made up for what I'd done, that words were useless compared to 7 months she'd already served in federal prison. But I was trying to do the right thing now, even though it was too late. I printed the letter, put it in an envelope, and looked up the prison's mailing address. I'd send it in the morning. I knew she might throw it away without reading it. She probably should. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. I grabbed it half asleep and saw 17 missed calls from Brad. Before I could process that, it rang again with his name on the screen. I answered, and he started screaming immediately. He wanted to know what I was doing talking to lawyers and my father. Someone had seen me at the state attorney's office yesterday, and word spread through our former friend group fast. They knew I was cooperating. I let him yell for maybe 30 seconds before I cut him off. I asked how he found out. He said Ara's mom worked in the courthouse and saw me going into the prosecutor's section with my father. Ara called Jansen, Jansen called him, and now they all knew I was talking. Brad's voice went from angry to threatening. He said if I testified against them, he'd tell everyone about my own crimes. He'd make sure the whole campus knew I was a cheater and a drug user, that I'd destroy my reputation just like I was trying to destroy theirs. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. Brad didn't understand that I'd already told my father everything. I'd confessed to the drug possession, the academic fraud, all of it. There was nothing left for Brad to expose because I'd exposed myself. I told him he should probably get a lawyer because federal prosecutors were reviewing evidence of the bomb threat right now. Evidence that proved he, Ara, and Jansen sent it from Sophie's phone while she was cleaning up Ara's vomit. The line went completely silent. I could hear Brad breathing on the other end, but he wasn't saying anything. I told him the prosecutors had video of Jansen recording the whole thing, audio of them laughing about it, and Sophie's testimony about where she actually was when the threat was sent. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt good, clean, like I'd finally stopped running from what we'd done. 3 hours later, Ara called. Her approach was completely different from Brad's threats. She was crying before she even said hello. She kept saying she was so sorry, that we were all just kids making mistakes, that Sophie would want us to move on and forgive each other. She said we could all get through this together if we just stuck together like we always had. I'd seen 3 years of Sophie's recordings by this point. I'd watched Ara use these exact same tactics on Sophie over and over. The fake tears, the appeals to friendship, the manipulation disguised as emotion. It was so transparent now that I wondered how I'd ever fallen for it. I told Ara that Sophie was in federal prison serving 7 years for terrorism charges because of our mistakes. I said I was done protecting people who threw Sophie away like garbage the second it was convenient. Ara's voice changed instantly. The tears stopped, and she started calling me a traitor and a snitch. She said I was destroying our lives for no reason, that Sophie knew what she was getting into by always taking the fall. I hung up while she was still talking. I felt even cleaner than I had after Brad's call. For 3 years I'd watched Ara manipulate Sophie and I'd said nothing. Now I was finally seeing her clearly. Jansen showed up at my apartment that night around 10 p.m. I heard the pounding on my door and looked through the peephole to see him standing there. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and unfocused, his movements jerky and paranoid. He was high. I opened the door, and he pushed past me into my apartment. He started demanding to know what I'd told the prosecutors. He kept pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair, talking fast. Jansen had always been the most unstable member of our group. He'd gotten worse over the past year with the drugs, more unpredictable, more volatile. I could see him trying to figure out if threatening me would work, or just make things worse for him. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app without him noticing. I hit record and slipped it into my pocket with the microphone facing out. Jansen kept ranting. He said Sophie knew what she was signing up for by always taking the fall, that she'd made her choice to be everyone's protector, and now she was dealing with the consequences. He said I was a traitor for going to the prosecutors, that real friends don't snitch on each other. He got close to me, invading my space, trying to intimidate me physically. I stayed calm and asked if he was threatening me. He backed off slightly but said I needed to think carefully about what I was doing, that there would be consequences if I testified. He left about 20 minutes later, still muttering threats as he walked out. I immediately pulled out my phone and stopped the recording. I had the whole conversation saved. I emailed it to Nolan with a brief explanation of what had just happened. He responded within 5 minutes saying this was witness intimidation, and he was adding it to the growing list of charges Jansen was facing. My father called me into his office the next afternoon. I drove to the state attorney's building expecting another strategy meeting. Instead, my father closed his office door and told me to sit down. He explained that Brad's family had hired Garrett Hamilton as their defense attorney. I recognized the name immediately. Garrett was one of the most expensive lawyers in the state, the kind who defended wealthy people accused of serious crimes and usually got them off. He'd been on the news multiple times for high-profile cases. My father said Garrett was also Brad's father, which explained why Brad's family could afford him. Garrett was calling in every favor he had to protect his son's medical school future. He'd already filed motions to suppress the evidence recordings, arguing they were obtained without proper consent. He was preparing character witnesses to testify that Brad was a good student with a bright future who made one mistake. My father looked tired when he said this case was going to get ugly. Garrett would use every legal tactic available to discredit the evidence and the witnesses. He'd try to paint Sophie as unstable, me as unreliable, and the recordings as inadmissible. He'd drag out the proceedings as long as possible, hoping we'd make a mistake or public interest would fade. I asked if we could still win. My father said yes, but it would take time and it would be brutal. He told me to be prepared for my entire life to be examined, for every mistake I'd ever made to be used against me in court. I walked into Nolan's office 3 days later for the formal deposition. The conference room had a long table with recording equipment set up at one end and a court reporter sitting ready with her machine. Nolan gestured for me to sit across from him and explained that everything I said would be recorded and transcribed, that I was under oath even though we weren't in a courtroom yet. The court reporter's fingers started moving the second I began talking. I went through every incident chronologically, starting with the weed charge sophomore year and working forward. Each crime took longer to explain than I expected, because Nolan kept asking follow-up questions about dates, locations, who else was present, what exactly Sophie said when she agreed to take the fall. He wanted every detail about the ethics final cheating, making me describe how I'd copied Sophie's notes word for word and how she'd claimed she gave them to me without knowing I'd used them to cheat. We spent 40 minutes just on Brad's assault case, going over how Sophie had positioned herself as the victim claiming self-defense when Brad was the one who'd thrown the punch. The DUI that Ara committed took another hour because Nolan needed me to explain how Sophie had convinced the police she was the driver, despite being completely sober. By hour 3, my throat was dry and my head hurt from remembering details I'd tried to forget. The court reporter never stopped typing, her fingers flying across the keys as I detailed 3 years of systematic exploitation. Nolan asked about the cocaine raid, and I had to describe watching Sophie get arrested while the rest of us hid in another room, how she'd spent the night in jail and never once mentioned our names to the police. When we got to the bomb threat, Nolan made me walk through the entire homecoming party timeline, even though I hadn't been there for the actual crime. He wanted to know why I'd left early, what Sophie had been doing when I saw her last, whether I'd known about Brad, Ara, and Jansen's plan. I told him I hadn't known until after Sophie was arrested, that I'd heard about it from other people at the party who'd seen Jansen recording. Nolan asked why I hadn't come forward then, and I had no good answer except that I was scared and selfish. The hardest part was explaining how I'd watched Brad, Ara, and Jansen testify against Sophie at her trial. Nolan made me recount specific things they'd said, how Ara had called Sophie unstable and attention-seeking, how Brad had claimed Sophie had always been erratic, how Jansen had suggested she'd sent the threat because she was jealous of our success. I had to admit that I'd sat in that courtroom and said nothing while they destroyed her. By hour 6, I felt completely empty, like I'd purged something toxic that had been sitting in my chest for months. The court reporter finally stopped typing and Nolan closed his folder. He told me I'd done well, that my testimony was detailed and consistent, that it would be crucial for both Sophie's appeal and the criminal cases against the others. I left his office feeling lighter, but also raw, like I'd scraped out an infected wound. 2 weeks passed before Sophie's lawyer called to arrange a prison visit. She explained that Sophie had agreed to see me, but made it clear this was Sophie's decision, and I should be prepared for her to be angry or cold or both. I drove out to the federal facility on a Saturday morning, and the 2 hours felt endless. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, trying to find words that would somehow make up for 7 months of her life lost to a cell. Nothing I came up with sounded adequate. I'd practiced apologizing 100 different ways, but every version felt hollow compared to what I'd let happen. The prison was 2 hours north in an area I'd never been to, all flat farmland and empty highways. I had to leave my phone and wallet in a locker before going through security, getting patted down and walked through a metal detector. A guard escorted me to the visitation room, which was just a big space with tables bolted to the floor and other inmates sitting with their visitors. Sophie came in through a different door, wearing a gray prison uniform that hung loose on her frame. She looked smaller than I remembered, like prison had physically diminished her. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a wariness that made my stomach hurt. She sat down across from me at one of the tables and just waited, her hands folded in front of her, not making this easier. I realized she shouldn't have to make anything easier ever again. I'd come here expecting to apologize and have her accept it, but looking at her face, I understood that forgiveness wasn't something I could just ask for and receive. I started to apologize, but she held up one hand to stop me. She asked if I was here because I felt guilty or because I actually wanted to help. Her voice was flat, no emotion in it, like she'd already decided what my answer would be. I told her both, that I felt guilty every day, but that wasn't why I'd gone to the prosecutors. I explained that I was cooperating fully with Nolan and her lawyer, that I'd spent 6 hours in a deposition detailing every crime she'd covered up for us. I said I was trying to get her conviction overturned, even though nothing could give her back the 7 months she'd already served. Sophie watched me while I talked, her expression not changing. When I finished, she asked why I'd finally decided to do something. I was honest because lying to her felt impossible after everything. I told her that watching Brad, Ara, and Jansen testify against her at trial while I stayed silent was the moment I realized I'd become someone I didn't recognize. That seeing her in handcuffs while they walked free had broken something in me that I couldn't fix by staying quiet anymore. Sophie nodded slowly and said she had a cellmate named Bianca who kept telling her that people don't change unless they hit rock bottom. She asked if maybe I'd finally hit mine. I said yes, that I'd hit it watching her get convicted for something she didn't do while I sat in the courtroom and did nothing. Before I left, Sophie told me about other times she'd taken the fall for people before our friend group. A high school boyfriend's vandalism charge where she'd claimed she was the one who spray-painted the school. Her college roommate's plagiarism case where Sophie had said she'd written the paper and let the roommate copy it. She said she'd always believed that protecting people were the same as caring about them, that being useful meant being loved. Prison had given her time to think about that pattern, about how she'd spent years being everyone's solution to their problems. She said she'd realized she was never anyone's actual friend, just their get-out-of-jail-free card, and she was done being that person. The guard told us time was up, and Sophie stood without saying goodbye. She walked back through the door she'd come from, and I sat there for another minute before I could make myself move. I cried the entire drive home, had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road through my tears. When I finally got back to my apartment around 6 p.m., there was a letter taped to my door. The envelope was expensive paper, the kind lawyers use, with a return address for a law firm downtown. I opened it standing in my hallway and read that Garrett Hamilton, Brad's father and attorney, was requesting a meeting to discuss the situation before things went too far. The letter was polite, but the threat underneath was clear. He wanted to assess what I knew and whether I could be convinced to stop cooperating. I took a photo of the letter with my phone and forwarded it to Nolan immediately. Nolan called me within 5 minutes. He said under no circumstances should I meet with Garrett without legal representation. He explained that Garrett was one of the best defense attorneys in the state, and he'd be trying to figure out how solid my testimony was and whether I could be scared or bought off. Nolan told me not to respond to the letter at all, that he'd handle communication with Brad's legal team. He also said I needed my own lawyer now that Garrett was making contact, someone whose job was to protect me from retaliation. I asked if I really needed protection, and Nolan said yes, that cases like this got ugly fast when wealthy families were involved. My father arranged everything the next day. He set me up with a public defender named Sarah Lancaster, who specialized in witness protection cases. I met her at her office downtown, expecting someone older and more serious, but Sarah was probably in her early 30s with a direct way of talking that put me at ease immediately. She made it clear right away that her job was to protect me from retaliation, not to judge what I'd done in the past. She asked me to tell her everything about the case, and I went through the whole story again. Sarah took notes and asked questions about Garrett's letter, about whether Brad or his family had contacted me directly, about any threats or intimidation I'd experienced. When I mentioned Jansen showing up at my apartment high and angry, she wrote that down and said we'd be filing a report about that too. Sarah drafted a response to Garrett declining the meeting request. She kept it professional but firm, stating that I was represented by counsel and all future communication should go through her office. We sent it that afternoon, and I felt relieved to have someone between me and Brad's family. The relief lasted 3 days. On Thursday, I noticed a man following me when I left my apartment to go to class. He stayed about 20 feet behind me, not trying to hide but making sure I saw him. I spotted him again that evening when I went to get food, and the next morning he was sitting in a car across from my building. I called Sarah and described what was happening. She asked me to get photos if I could do it safely, so I took pictures of the man and his car with my phone. Sarah filed a harassment complaint with the police that same day. The private investigator backed off after that, but the message was clear. Brad's family would fight dirty to protect their son's future, and they wanted me to know they were watching. I spent the next week avoiding my phone while Nolan worked through Sophie's evidence files at the federal prosecutor's office downtown. He called me on Friday afternoon and asked me to come in immediately because he'd found something that changed the scope of the entire investigation. I drove there expecting another round of questions about Brad and Jansen, but when I walked into his office, he had printed photos spread across his desk showing people I didn't even recognize. Nolan explained that Sophie's recordings went far beyond our immediate friend group and documented her taking blame for at least 6 other students over 3 years. There was video of her claiming responsibility for vandalism she didn't commit, audio of her accepting academic dishonesty charges for plagiarism someone else did, files showing she'd covered everything from theft to assault for people who weren't even part of our social circle. He showed me a spreadsheet he'd created tracking 49 separate incidents instead of the 43 I'd initially reported, and the pattern was identical every time. Sophie protected people, they moved on with their lives, and she carried the consequences alone. One name kept appearing in the files from sophomore year. Bailey Mathis had been a scholarship athlete on the soccer team with a full ride and Olympic development program prospects, and Sophie had taken the fall for her in a hit-and-run accident that could have destroyed everything Bailey was working toward. The recording showed Bailey drunk at a party off campus, getting behind the wheel despite Sophie trying to stop her, then panicking after she sideswiped a parked car and drove away. Campus security found the damaged vehicle the next morning with paint transfer that matched Bailey's car, but before they could question her, Sophie walked into the security office and claimed she'd been the one driving. She gave a statement saying she'd borrowed Bailey's car without permission and hit the parked vehicle while trying to parallel park, then panicked and left the scene. Bailey kept her scholarship and her spot on the team while Sophie got charged with leaving the scene of an accident and paid restitution for the damages. Nolan said he needed to contact Bailey immediately because her testimony could establish the exploitation pattern that Sophie's appeal required. He asked if I knew how to reach her, and I pulled up her social media on my phone, finding that she was still at the university and still playing soccer. Nolan sent her a formal request for an interview through her university email that same afternoon, and Bailey responded within 2 hours, saying she'd meet with him the next day. I wasn't there for their initial conversation, but Nolan called me afterwards and said Bailey had broken down crying within 5 minutes of him explaining why he was investigating Sophie's case. She admitted she'd felt guilty for 2 years about letting Sophie take the blame, but didn't know how to help without destroying her own future and losing everything she'd worked for since she was 6 years old. When Nolan told her that Sophie was in federal prison serving 7 years for a bomb threat she didn't send, Bailey asked what she needed to do to help. And Nolan said her testimony about the hit and run would show that Sophie had a documented history of protecting others even at severe personal cost. Bailey signed a sworn statement that week, detailing the entire hit-and-run incident and Sophie's decision to claim responsibility. She also provided her own recordings from that night, showing Sophie trying to stop her from driving and then showing up at Bailey's dorm room the next morning to tell her not to worry, because she'd already told security it was her fault. Nolan added Bailey's case to the growing file of evidence showing Sophie's pattern of self-sacrifice, and Sophie's lawyer immediately began drafting a motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The motion took 3 weeks to complete because it had to include detailed summaries of my testimony, Bailey's testimony, and the extensive recordings Sophie had made, documenting that she regularly took blame for crimes she didn't commit. Sophie's lawyer filed the motion with the federal court in early December, and the judge assigned a hearing date for mid-January, giving us 6 weeks to prepare our testimonies and gather any additional evidence. The university's administration somehow learned about the case developments before the motion became public record, probably through their legal department monitoring federal court filings. They released a statement saying they were cooperating fully with law enforcement and conducting their own internal review of the original incident, which was corporate language, meaning they were covering their liability and preparing for the lawsuits that would follow if Sophie's conviction got overturned. The statement made the local news, and suddenly everyone on campus was talking about Sophie's case again. But this time the narrative was different, because reporters were asking questions about how a student could be convicted of terrorism while maintaining her innocence and having her friends testify against her. Kiana Mercer, the campus security officer who'd testified at Sophie's original trial about finding her phone and the suspicious timing, saw the news coverage and contacted Sophie's lawyer directly. She admitted she'd had serious doubts about Sophie's guilt during the investigation because Sophie's behavior didn't match someone who'd just sent a bomb threat, but she felt pressured by the FBI and the prosecution to support their narrative that Sophie was attention-seeking and unstable. The same week the motion was filed, federal marshals showed up at Brad's apartment, Ara's sorority house, and Jansen's off-campus rental to formally notify them that they were targets of a federal investigation into the bomb threat and state investigations into multiple other crimes documented in Sophie's recordings. Brad called his father immediately, and Garrett went into full defense mode, hiring a crisis management firm and scheduling interviews with friendly media outlets. He gave a statement to the local news calling the prosecution a witch hunt based on unreliable recordings made by a vindictive former friend seeking attention, and he emphasized that his son had been a witness at Sophie's trial and had testified truthfully under oath. Garrett's strategy was obvious because I'd seen my father use similar tactics in his cases. Attack the credibility of the evidence, paint the prosecution as politically motivated, and remind everyone that Brad had already testified at trial, so charging him now looked like double jeopardy, even though it wasn't. Garrett's media offensive lasted 3 days before it completely backfired. A journalist named Amira Devine, who covered criminal justice issues for the state's largest newspaper, saw his interviews and decided to actually review the court records from Sophie's original trial, instead of just repeating what Garrett claimed. She spent a week reading transcripts and watching recorded testimony, and she realized that Sophie had maintained her innocence throughout the entire trial, while her friends testified against her with identical stories about her being unstable and attention-seeking. Amira started investigating the case independently, tracking down people who knew Sophie and discovering that multiple students had stories about her taking blame for things she didn't do. She found Bailey through the soccer team and got her to confirm on the record that Sophie had covered for her in the hit and run, and she found 2 other students who admitted Sophie had taken academic dishonesty charges for them. The pattern was undeniable once someone actually looked for it, and Amira had the investigative skills that the original prosecutors either lacked or ignored. Amira contacted me through Sarah in mid-December, asking for an interview, and Sarah forwarded the request to Nolan and my father for approval. They discussed it for 2 days, before agreeing that going public might actually help Sophie's case by building public pressure for a fair hearing and making it harder for Garrett to control the narrative. Nolan gave me specific guidance about what I could and couldn't discuss because of the ongoing investigation, but he said I should tell the truth about how Sophie protected us and how we repaid her. I met Amira at a coffee shop near campus and spent 3 hours telling her everything on the record. I explained how Sophie had been our group's protector for 3 years, memorizing security patterns and keeping emergency alibis ready, taking the fall for drug possession and academic fraud and assault charges. I told her about homecoming night and the bomb threat, about how Brad, Ara, and Jansen used Sophie's phone to send the message while she was cleaning up Ara's vomit, about how they laughed and said Sophie would handle it like she always did. I admitted that I'd been part of the problem for years, letting Sophie sacrifice herself because it was easier than facing consequences, and that I'd stayed silent even when our friends testified against her at trial. Amira's article ran on the front page of the Sunday paper with the headline, "The Friend Who Took the Fall One Time Too Many," and a photo of Sophie from before her arrest, looking happy and normal. The article detailed Sophie's 3-year pattern of protecting others, the bomb threat that landed her in federal prison, and the new evidence suggesting she'd been framed by the people she'd spent years protecting. Amira interviewed Bailey and Kiana Mercer, and even got a quote from Bianca, Sophie's cellmate, about how Sophie maintained her innocence every single day in prison. The article went viral on social media within hours, shared thousands of times by people outraged that a young woman was serving 7 years for protecting her friends. Public opinion shifted dramatically overnight, because suddenly Sophie wasn't a terrorist. She was a victim of exploitation who'd been betrayed by people she trusted. Brad, Ara, and Jansen became the villains in a story that people couldn't stop talking about, and by Monday morning, there were student protests on campus, demanding accountability and calling for the university to take action. Ara cracked first under the pressure of the protests and the social media backlash and the reality that she was facing federal terrorism charges. Her lawyer, Nicholas Knight, contacted Nolan on Tuesday morning about a potential cooperation agreement, and by Wednesday afternoon, Ara was sitting in a conference room at the federal prosecutor's office offering to testify against Brad and Jansen in exchange for reduced charges. She claimed Brad had manipulated her into typing the threat message, that she'd been drunk and didn't fully understand what they were doing, that Jansen had been the one recording and encouraging everything. Nicholas emphasized that Ara was willing to provide complete testimony about the planning and execution of the bomb threat, including details that only someone present would know. And he argued that her cooperation should result in significantly reduced charges compared to Brad and Jansen, who were refusing to cooperate. Nolan spent 2 days reviewing the recordings before agreeing to meet with Ara and Nicholas. He called me on Thursday morning to say he wanted me present for the meeting, because I could identify when Ara was lying based on her patterns from the recordings. We met at the federal building downtown in a small conference room with gray walls and a table that had seen better days. Ara looked terrible when she walked in, hair unwashed and dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in weeks. Nicholas sat beside her with his briefcase open and a legal pad covered in notes. Nolan started by playing 3 recordings from Sophie's files, showing Ara enthusiastically participating in crimes, laughing while Sophie took the blame, even suggesting once that they should use Sophie more often since she never complained. Ara's face went white as her own voice filled the room, and Nicholas put his hand on her arm like he was worried she might bolt. Nolan asked Ara to explain why anyone should believe her cooperation was genuine when the evidence showed she'd been a willing participant for 3 years. Ara started crying and saying Brad had manipulated her, that she was drunk most of the time and didn't understand what they were doing, but I'd seen the recordings, and she was stone sober in at least half of them. Nicholas jumped in with his prepared speech about how Ara's testimony could fill gaps in the evidence and provide details only someone present would know, like how Brad had been the one to suggest using Sophie's phone specifically because her typing style was distinctive. Nolan listened without expression, then said he'd consider a cooperation agreement if Ara provided a full written statement, submitted to a polygraph, and agreed to testify against both Brad and Jansen. He made it clear her own charges wouldn't disappear just because she cooperated, but they might be reduced from terrorism to conspiracy, depending on how useful her testimony proved. Ara agreed immediately, almost desperately, and Nicholas started drafting terms right there at the table. Nolan told them he'd have a formal agreement ready by Monday and that Ara shouldn't contact Brad or Jansen under any circumstances. We left the building, and Nolan said he didn't trust Ara's sudden conscience, but her testimony could strengthen the case even if her motives were purely self-serving. 2 days after Ara agreed to cooperate, my phone started ringing at 2 a.m. with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored the first 3, then listened to the voicemail on the 4th one. A male voice I didn't recognize said, "Snitches get stitches," and mentioned my younger sister by name, said she walked home from the school the same route every day. I sat up in bed feeling sick and immediately called Sarah, who told me to save all the messages and not respond to any calls. The messages kept coming over the next 6 hours, some threatening me directly and others making vague references to what happens to families of people who testify. One message specifically mentioned my father's office address and the time he usually left work. Sarah contacted law enforcement first thing Monday morning and brought copies of all the messages to Nolan. He listened to them with his jaw getting tighter with each one, then made a call to someone in the FBI. Sarah explained that witness intimidation was a federal crime and Jansen was stupid enough to have his friends leave the threats from traceable numbers. By Tuesday afternoon, federal agents had tracked 3 of the calls back to Jansen's known associates, and one of them admitted Jansen had asked them to scare me into not testifying. The agents arrested Jansen at his apartment before his lawyer could advise him to stop making things worse for himself. Jansen tried to claim he didn't know his friends were going to threaten anyone, but his own text messages showed him giving them my number and my sister's school schedule. Sarah said Jansen had just added witness intimidation and conspiracy charges to his already serious legal problems, and his bail from the original investigation was immediately revoked. The judge ordered him held without bail pending trial because he'd proven himself a danger to witnesses. Jansen's lawyer tried to argue that his client was just scared and made poor decisions, but the judge wasn't interested in excuses for threatening a minor. Jansen's lawyer contacted Nolan 3 days after the arrest trying to negotiate a plea deal. I wasn't present for that meeting, but Nolan called me afterward to explain what happened. Jansen was facing federal terrorism charges for the bomb threat, state drug charges from Sophie's evidence files showing him dealing cocaine on campus, and now federal witness intimidation charges. His lawyer admitted that going to trial would likely result in decades in prison given the evidence, and he wanted to discuss what kind of deal might be available if Jansen cooperated. Nolan told him he wasn't interested in leniency for someone who threatened witnesses and their families. The drug crimes from the evidence files added at least 8 years to Jansen's potential sentence because they showed a pattern of dealing rather than personal use. Sophie's recordings documented Jansen selling to other students, including one transaction where he'd joked about how Sophie would take the fall if campus security ever caught him. Nolan said Jansen's lawyer looked defeated by the end of the meeting, acknowledging that his client had destroyed any chance of a favorable deal by intimidating witnesses. The best Jansen could hope for was pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a full confession, but even that would likely mean 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Jansen's lawyer said he'd talked to his client about accepting responsibility, but Nolan doubted Jansen had the maturity to admit what he'd done. Brad stayed silent through all of this, not contacting me or anyone else in the former friend group. His father Garrett was handling everything, filing motions and giving carefully worded statements to the press about how the evidence was questionable. 3 weeks after Jansen's arrest, Garrett filed a motion to suppress Sophie's recordings, arguing they were obtained without proper consent and violated Brad's privacy rights. The motion claimed Sophie had secretly recorded private conversations in violation of state wiretapping laws and that any evidence from those recordings should be excluded from trial. Nolan spent a week preparing his response, and I helped him identify which recordings showed Sophie being explicitly asked to record conversations as insurance in case anyone got caught. Several of the recordings included Brad or Jansen specifically telling Sophie to document things so they'd have proof if needed later. The hearing on the motion took place in early January, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. Garrett argued passionately that Sophie had violated his son's constitutional rights by recording him without permission, and that allowing the evidence would set a dangerous precedent. Sophie's lawyer attended the hearing and presented evidence that Sophie had been recording to protect herself, not to violate anyone's privacy. She showed the judge messages from Brad and others explicitly asking Sophie to keep records of events. The judge took 2 days to rule, then issued a decision stating that Sophie had every right to record crimes she was asked to cover up, and that Brad had no reasonable expectation of privacy when committing felonies. The judge noted that several recordings showed Brad and others specifically requesting documentation, which meant they'd consented to being recorded even if they didn't realize Sophie was keeping the files. Garrett's motion was denied completely, and the judge added that the recordings were some of the most compelling evidence of systematic criminal activity he'd seen in 20 years on the bench. Sophie's appeal hearing arrived on a cold morning in late January. I'd been preparing for weeks, reviewing my testimony with Nolan and Sophie's lawyer, practicing how to explain 3 years of exploitation without making excuses for my own role. The federal courthouse downtown was newer than the state building, all glass and steel with security checkpoints that took 30 minutes to clear. Sophie was brought in wearing prison clothes with her hands cuffed in front of her, and seeing her like that made me feel physically ill. Her parents sat in the front row looking exhausted, and Bianca was there too, having been released 2 weeks earlier. The federal prosecutor who originally convicted Sophie sat at his table looking uncomfortable, shuffling papers, and avoiding eye contact with anyone. I took the stand first and spent 3 hours answering questions about how our friend group had used Sophie. I explained how she'd memorized campus security patterns and kept emergency alibis ready, how we'd all relied on her to fix our problems no matter what stupid thing we did. I detailed specific crimes she'd covered for me, the weed possession charge she took so I wouldn't get expelled, the ethics exam she took blame for while I kept my scholarship. I admitted that I'd let her sacrifice herself over and over because it was easier than facing consequences. Sophie's lawyer asked me to describe the bomb threat night, and I explained how Brad, Ara, and Jansen had used Sophie's phone while she was cleaning up Ara's vomit, how they'd laughed about Sophie handling it like she always did. I testified about their 20 calls from Holding that we ignored, about Brad telling her not to worry before hanging up to keep partying. The federal prosecutor who'd convicted Sophie kept shifting in his seat as I described how we'd all lied at her trial, how we'd testified that she was unstable and attention-seeking when we knew she'd spent 3 years protecting us. I explained that Sophie's recordings proved she hadn't committed most of the crimes on her record, that she'd taken blame for 43 separate incidents to protect people who saw her as disposable. By the time I finished testifying, my voice was hoarse, and the prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Bailey took the stand after a short break and testified about the hit-and-run incident from sophomore year. She explained how she'd been drunk and hit a parked car, how she'd panicked and driven away because she was on an athletic scholarship. Sophie had claimed she was driving to save Bailey's eligibility, had dealt with the insurance company and the car owner and campus security without ever mentioning Bailey's name. Bailey's voice shook as she described how Sophie had taken points on her license and paid the deductible from her own money, how she'd never asked for anything in return. Sophie's lawyer used Bailey's testimony to establish a pattern of behavior that contradicted the prosecution's original theory that Sophie sent the bomb threat for attention. If Sophie's instinct was always to protect others and take blame, why would she suddenly threaten the university for no reason? Bailey testified that Sophie had specifically told her the hit and run was no big deal, that taking care of people were what friends did. The prosecutor tried to argue on cross-examination that Sophie's pattern of taking blame proved she had a history of dishonest behavior, but Bailey shut that down by pointing out that Sophie's dishonesty had always been in service of protecting others, never for personal gain. Kiana Mercer testified next about her concerns during the original investigation. She'd been the campus security officer who'd worked the homecoming party, and she admitted that the friend group's story had bothered her at the time. Their testimony against Sophie had been too coordinated, too polished, like they'd rehearsed what to say. She'd reported her concerns to her supervisor, but campus security had felt pressured to support the FBI's case once federal terrorism charges were filed. Kiana testified that she'd specifically noted in her report that Sophie had been cleaning the bathroom when the threat was sent, which should have raised questions about how she could have typed and sent a message while dealing with someone actively vomiting. Bianca Carrillo's testimony was the most powerful of the day. She walked to the stand wearing regular clothes, her 7-month sentence for check fraud having ended 2 weeks earlier. She testified that she'd been Sophie's cellmate for 5 months, and that Sophie had maintained her innocence every single day while still helping other inmates with their legal cases. Bianca described how Sophie had helped her understand her own appeal options, had spent hours in the prison library researching case law, had written letters to lawyers on behalf of 3 other inmates who couldn't afford representation. She explained that Sophie's instinct was always to protect and help people, that she'd seen Sophie break up fights between inmates and councilwomen who were suicidal. Bianca testified that the bomb threat was completely inconsistent with Sophie's character, that someone who spent their time in prison helping others wasn't someone who would threaten innocent people. She described conversations where Sophie had talked about her confusion over why her friends abandoned her, how she'd believed until the trial that they would tell the truth. Bianca's voice got stronger as she testified that Sophie was the kind of person who took care of everyone around her, even when it cost her everything, and that the only crime she'd actually committed was trusting the wrong people. The prosecutor barely cross-examined Bianca, perhaps recognizing that attacking a woman who'd befriended Sophie in prison would make him look worse. Agent Tiago Soto took the stand after lunch, looking uncomfortable in his suit. He'd been the FBI agent who arrested Sophie at the homecoming party, and Sophie's lawyer questioned him about the original investigation. He admitted that the FBI had focused on Sophie immediately because the threat came from her phone, and that they'd never seriously investigated her claims that someone else had used it. The friend group's testimony that Sophie was unstable had seemed credible at the time, and the FBI had been under pressure to solve a terrorism case quickly. He acknowledged that if they'd looked deeper into the friend group dynamics, they might have discovered the pattern of exploitation and questioned whether the friends had motive to lie. Sophie's lawyer asked if the FBI had investigated whether anyone else had access to Sophie's phone that night, and he admitted they hadn't checked for fingerprints or done any forensic analysis beyond tracking the message. They'd assumed Sophie was guilty based on whose phone sent the threat and the testimony of her friends. He testified that in hindsight, the investigation had been too narrow, too focused on the obvious suspect without considering alternative explanations. The prosecutor tried to argue that the FBI had followed proper procedures, but Agent Soto contradicted him by admitting that standard protocol would have included checking Sophie's location at the time the threat was sent and interviewing witnesses who weren't part of her immediate friend group. Garrett Hamilton made a critical mistake during his cross-examination of one of Sophie's character witnesses. The witness was describing how Sophie had always been the responsible one in any group, and Garrett interrupted to suggest that Sophie had brought this on herself by always taking the fall for others. He argued that if Sophie hadn't established a pattern of accepting blame, she wouldn't have been a believable suspect for the bomb threat. The judge's expression changed immediately, his eyebrows going up and his mouth tightening. Sophie's lawyer jumped on the comment during redirect, asking the witness if Sophie's kindness and willingness to help others meant she deserved to be framed for terrorism. The witness said absolutely not, that blaming Sophie for being exploited was like blaming any victim for the crimes committed against them. Sophie's lawyer used Garrett's comment in her closing argument, emphasizing how even Brad's own lawyer was victim-blaming, suggesting that Sophie's compassion was somehow a character flaw that justified what had been done to her. She pointed out that Garrett's comment revealed exactly the mentality that had allowed Brad, Ara, and Jansen to exploit Sophie for 3 years. The idea that her willingness to help made her responsible for how others used that willingness against her. The judge made a note on his legal pad, and I could see Garrett realize he'd made a serious mistake. The hearing concluded with closing arguments that stretched into the late afternoon. Sophie's lawyer stood at the podium and delivered a summary that made several people in the courtroom cry. She described how Sophie had been a young woman whose compassion was systematically exploited by people she considered friends, how her willingness to help had been weaponized and turned into evidence against her. She detailed the 3 years of Sophie taking falls for crimes she didn't commit, always believing she was helping friends who would do the same for her. She explained how Brad, Ara, and Jansen had used Sophie's phone to send a bomb threat as a prank, never considering the consequences, because they assumed Sophie would handle it like she always did. When Sophie couldn't fix it, when the FBI arrested her and federal charges were filed, those friends had testified against her to save themselves. They'd taken Sophie's history of helping them and twisted it into evidence of criminal behavior and instability. Sophie's lawyer argued that the original trial had been fundamentally unfair because Sophie's defense attorney hadn't known about the exploitation pattern and couldn't challenge the friend's testimony effectively. The new evidence from Sophie's recordings proved that she'd been framed by the very people she'd spent years protecting, and that her conviction was based on lies told by witnesses with every reason to deceive the court. She asked the judge to overturn the conviction and order Sophie's immediate release, noting that Sophie had already served 7 months for a crime she didn't commit, while the actual perpetrators remained free. The federal prosecutor's closing argument was notably brief, acknowledging that the new evidence raised serious questions about the original conviction and that his office would not oppose Sophie's release pending further investigation. The judge thanked both lawyers and said he would take the matter under advisement, promising a ruling within 2 weeks. Sophie was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, but she looked back at her parents and Bianca with something like hope in her eyes for the first time since I'd visited her in prison. 3 days after the hearing, I woke up to my phone buzzing with news alerts. Federal marshals had arrested Brad at his parents' house that morning. The charges were serious, making a terroristic threat, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. I pulled up the local news website and saw a photo of Brad being led out in handcuffs while Garrett stood on the front lawn, already on his phone with lawyers. The article said, Garrett posted the $1 million bail within 2 hours. Brad was released by noon, pending trial, but the damage was done. Everyone knew now. His name was in the papers connected to terrorism charges. His med school applications were probably getting pulled as I read the story. Ara got arrested the same afternoon. Her cooperation agreement meant she got released on lower bail with electronic monitoring. The news showed a photo of her leaving the courthouse with an ankle bracelet visible above her shoe. She looked smaller somehow, like she'd shrunk since I last saw her. Jansen didn't get bail at all. The witness intimidation charges violated his original bail conditions from when he got arrested for threatening my family. The judge denied bail entirely, citing flight risk and danger to witnesses. Jansen was staying in custody until trial. My phone started ringing. Friends I hadn't talked to in months were calling, texting, sending messages asking if I'd seen the news. People from campus were posting about it on social media. Someone started a thread on the university subreddit, and it got thousands of comments within hours. The story went national by evening. CNN picked it up. Fox News ran a segment. The headlines were all variations of the same theme. College students framing their friend for terrorism to cancel exams. Legal experts were already on TV debating whether this represented a new low in campus culture or just an extreme example of privilege and accountability problems that had always existed. One professor said it showed how young people today had no sense of consequences. Another argued it revealed systemic issues with how we treat kindness as weakness. My father called me that night and asked me to come to his office the next morning. His voice was serious, but not angry. I knew what was coming. I showed up at 8, and he was already at his desk, looking tired. He gestured for me to sit down, and then he explained that my cooperation would be considered favorably by the DA's office. But I wasn't immune from consequences for my own past crimes. The DA was reviewing whether to charge me with the original drug possession case from 3 years ago and the academic fraud from my ethics class. I could face probation or community service depending on the final decisions. He watched my face carefully as he said this, probably waiting to see if I'd panic or ask him to make it go away. I took a breath and told him I understood, that I'd accept whatever consequences came. Watching Sophie walk into that courtroom in prison clothes taught me that accountability isn't optional. You don't get to pick and choose when you face what you did. He looked relieved when I said that. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. He told me he was proud that I finally did the right thing, even though it came too late to prevent Sophie from suffering. We sat there quietly for a minute, and I realized this was the first real conversation we'd had in years. 2 weeks passed in a strange blur of waiting. Nolan kept me updated on the case developments. Ara's lawyer was negotiating her plea deal. Jansen's public defender was trying to find any angle to reduce his charges, but the witness intimidation made everything worse. Garrett was filing motions for Brad, challenging every piece of evidence, trying to get the recordings thrown out. Then, on a Tuesday morning, Sophie's lawyer called me. The federal judge had issued his ruling. Sophie's conviction was overturned based on newly discovered evidence and ineffective assistance of counsel. I pulled up the court documents online and read the opinion. The judge wrote pages about how Sophie's original defense attorney failed to investigate the friend group dynamics or challenge their testimony properly. He explained how the prosecution built its entire case on the word of people who had motive to lie. The judge said Sophie's willingness to help others had been weaponized against her, and that the original trial was fundamentally unfair. Sophie's release was scheduled for 10 days later to process all the paperwork. Her lawyer called me again that afternoon and said Sophie wanted to see me when she got out. My stomach dropped when I heard that. I was scared and hopeful at the same time. Sophie being free didn't mean she forgave me. It didn't mean our friendship could be salvaged or that she'd ever trust me again. but she wanted to see me. That had to mean something. The university issued a formal apology 3 days later. The president held a press conference and read a statement about how they failed Sophie and were committed to doing better. They offered to readmit her with a full scholarship to complete her degree. They announced new policies about investigating claims of innocence more thoroughly and providing better support for students who reported being pressured by peers. It all sounded good, but felt hollow. Sophie had lost 7 months of her life. Her parents were still paying off the mortgage they took for her bail. A press conference and some policy changes didn't fix that. Brad's trial got scheduled for 4 months out. Garrett was already fighting every motion, filing endless appeals, trying to delay everything as long as possible. Ara's cooperation meant she'd probably plead guilty to reduced charges and serve minimal prison time. Jansen faced the harshest penalties because of his witness intimidation and his extensive drug crimes from Sophie's recordings. Nolan called me in to explain how the different outcomes would probably play out. We sat in his office and he walked me through the likely scenarios. Jansen would probably accept a plea deal for 8 to 12 years because going to trial would mean decades in prison. Ara might get 2 to 3 years with most of it suspended because of her cooperation. Brad's outcome depended entirely on whether his father's legal tactics worked. The disparity bothered me. They were all equally guilty of framing Sophie. They all typed that message or hit send or recorded it happening. But Jansen would serve the most time because he was poor and made things worse by threatening people. Ara would serve the least because she was smart enough to cooperate early. Brad's fate depended on how much money Garrett could throw at lawyers. I told Nolan it didn't seem fair. He shrugged and said, "That's how the justice system works. Cooperation and resources matter as much as culpability, sometimes more. The people who can afford good lawyers and know when to make deals get better outcomes than people who can't. It's not right, but it's reality." I left his office feeling sick about the whole system, but also knowing there was nothing I could do to change it. Sophie was getting out. That was what mattered. The people who framed her were facing consequences even if those consequences weren't equal. It was more justice than Sophie had gotten at her original trial when everyone believed Brad and Ara and Jansen over her. A week after the judge's ruling, the DA charged me with misdemeanor obstruction of justice for lying to campus security about the weed in our suite 3 years ago. My father called me into his office and explained that cooperation didn't mean immunity and that the best thing I could do was plead guilty and accept responsibility. I sat across from him and nodded, understanding that this was part of paying for what I'd done. The hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in the same courthouse where Sophie's appeal had been heard. I stood before a different judge and pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, and the judge sentenced me to 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered me to speak at campus events about the consequences of letting friends take the fall for your mistakes. The probation officer handed me paperwork about check-in requirements and restrictions, and I signed everything without reading it carefully, because the specifics didn't matter as much as the fact that I was finally being held accountable. The community service requirement actually felt right in a way I hadn't expected. Sophie's lawyer reached out a few days later about a project she was starting to provide legal resources to people who were wrongly convicted, and I volunteered immediately. The work involved organizing case files, researching appeals procedures, and helping people navigate the system that had failed Sophie. It didn't undo what I'd done, but it gave me somewhere to channel the guilt that still woke me up at 3 in the morning. I spent my first Saturday sorting through boxes of legal documents in a cramped office downtown, and every case file reminded me of Sophie sitting in that visitation room telling me about the other inmates she'd helped with their appeals. The project coordinator explained that most wrongful convictions involved patterns similar to Sophie's case, where people with resources and credibility testified against people without either, and the system believed the wrong side. Sophie's release day arrived 10 days after the judge's ruling, and I wasn't there because she'd asked me not to come. Her lawyer called to let me know that Sophie wanted her first moments of freedom to be with her parents and Bianca, who'd been released 2 weeks earlier after serving her full sentence. I respected Sophie's boundary, even though I desperately wanted to see her walk out of that prison, to witness the moment when she stopped being an inmate and became a free person again. Instead, I stayed in my apartment and watched the clock, calculating when she'd be processed out, when she'd walk through those gates, when she'd breathe air that wasn't filtered through prison ventilation systems. My phone stayed silent all day, and I didn't expect it to ring because Sophie didn't owe me updates or inclusion in her life. 3 days passed before Sophie agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near campus. I got there 20 minutes early and sat at a corner table, watching the door and trying to prepare myself for seeing her outside of that visitation room. She walked in, looking different in ways that went beyond the obvious physical changes. She was thinner, her shoulders held differently, and there was a wariness in her eyes that broke my heart because I'd helped put it there. We sat down, and she ordered black coffee, and I waited for her to speak first because this meeting was on her terms. She told me she wasn't ready to forgive me yet, maybe never would be, but she appreciated that I'd finally told the truth. Her voice was steady but distant, like she was talking to someone she used to know but didn't anymore. Sophie explained that her mother Nikki and her father were still paying off the mortgage they'd taken for her bail, sending monthly payments that would continue for years. 7 months in federal prison had given her PTSD that she was working through in therapy twice a week, and the sessions helped, but didn't erase the hypervigilance that made her jump at loud noises. The non-profit job she'd had lined up was gone because they'd filled the position and moved on, and finding work was difficult, despite her exoneration, because her criminal record wouldn't be fully expunged for months. Background checks still showed the terrorism charges, even though the conviction had been overturned, and most employers didn't bother asking for explanations before rejecting her applications. She was living with her parents and trying to figure out what came next, but every day felt like walking through fog without knowing where the ground was solid. I offered to help however I could with money, references, connections through my father, anything that might make things easier. Sophie considered my offer for a long moment before saying she'd think about it. She wasn't ready to rely on me for anything yet, didn't trust that I wouldn't disappear again when things got complicated, but she wasn't completely closing the door either. That felt like more than I deserved, more grace than I'd shown her in 3 years of letting her take falls for me. We finished our coffee, and she left first, and I sat there for another hour, thinking about how the person who'd protected everyone for so long now had walls up so high I might never scale them. Over the next month, Sophie and I met occasionally for coffee at different shops around town. The meetings were her idea, scheduled when she felt ready, and I never pushed for more than she offered. Slowly, she started opening up about her experience in prison, the women she'd met, the things she'd learned about herself when there was nothing to do but think. She talked about her plans for the future in careful terms, considering going back to the school, but wanting to take time to heal first. She was working with Bianca on a support group for people who were wrongly convicted, using her own experience to help others navigate the trauma of incarceration and the complicated process of rebuilding after exoneration. Our conversations were careful and bounded, circling around topics we weren't ready to address directly, but there was a tentative foundation being built from honesty instead of the exploitation that had defined our previous friendship. 4 months after Sophie's release, I attended her first public speaking event at the university. The lecture hall was packed with students, faculty, and community members who'd followed her case in the news. Sophie stood at the podium looking nervous but determined, and when she started talking about the dangers of always being the person who fixes everyone else's problems, the room went completely silent. She explained how she'd spent years believing that protecting people meant caring about them, and how she'd learned in prison to recognize when helping becomes enabling. She talked about setting boundaries and understanding that real friends don't ask you to sacrifice yourself repeatedly, and that taking the fall for someone else's mistakes doesn't make you noble, it makes you a target. When she mentioned that one former friend finally did the right thing even though it came too late, she looked directly at me with an expression that wasn't quite forgiveness, but might be the beginning of understanding. I sat in the back row and listened to her reclaim her voice and her story, knowing I'd spend years earning back even a fraction of her trust. Watching her stand up there and turn her worst experience into something that might help others gave me hope that some damage, while permanent and real, doesn't have to define everything that comes after.